Hello everyone, Master Xeon1001 here, and in this video we'll be going over the release log to Boxcutter 717_18. Boxcutter's latest update is the biggest one to date, not in additions but in functionality improvements. I felt Boxcutter had three pillars to streamline the user experience prior to even drawing a box. Orientation, dictating whether the surface, view, cursor, or world was being used. Alignment, initial draw rotation affecting the initial positioning of the draw before you even begin. Snapping, in-gone angle, snap, and first point support in addition to the dot system, which allowed for pre-positioning of shapes before even beginning the operation. Special mention also goes to grid. Grid was always the weakest aspect of BC and required the most attention. While it fulfilled the initial purpose, there contained bugs and issues I felt hampered the user experience. In retrospect, now I can respectfully call it a shortcoming. Orientation has always been a work in progress since the tool began. I can recall so many escapades we had to deal with to get to this point. Alignment was a new concept but not fully implemented. It served the purpose of solving a singular issue, aligning box draw in edit mode to a selected edge. This aspect contained the most potential and would serve as a hand of God in assisting with placement and initial orientation. The idea was impressive, the implementation was incomplete. Snapping was a long journey in coming. First we had to add dots to assist the simple shapes, but next was n-gon and the special needs that it would have alone. First point snapping ensured we would align the last point to the first without a grid. It was essential to be able to deal with angles and snapping without a grid due to the design constraints that a permanent grid required. Angle controls were of the utmost importance to n-gon, but even that required local orientation support to get users back to their magnetic north. I am most proud of the recent updates to snapping, but I felt there was much more work to be done. Grid was added in a rush, admittedly. I'm not the type to toil with something for a long amount of time to perfect, refine, and understand to truly ensure it flows with the user. Grid was unable to get that luxury, however. In the time since 715, I've contemplated, conspired, and come to hate what the grid has become, and realized something had to be done. Grid is easy to associate with the main aspect of snapping, but there's so much more to it than that, especially with us. We want a type of snap capable without grid that allows for free-form angle cutting, but also orientation. And now I feel we have accomplished that goal, but there is always, of course, more work to be done. This update aims to bring all these systems together, fixing so many long-time legacy bugs that the release log looks like a rewrite. I'm so proud of the work that the team has put in. As I oversaw the work being done on this, it was apparent that nothing was going to be easy, nor was it going to be, and it would take iteration after iteration to properly perfect. This work has been months in the making, and this isn't even our oldest unpublished new edition. I love Boxcutter and Hops for that matter. As long as I'm working with them, I will continue to hope and work towards their refinement and perfection. Without further ado, let's get into what's new for this release. I apologize for the monologue. 718 will be an interesting release. When it comes to new users getting acquainted with Boxcutter, it can seem daunting with the amount of hotkeys that are available, and for that reason we've made it available where whenever you press N, you can bring up your NPanel and go to the Boxcutter panel, and from here there will be an area dedicated to displaying hotkeys on the screen. So if I stop my animation and just perform a box cut, you can see that now the NPanel has expanded to display all the available hotkeys for changing between the various types of cutters and different types of operations you can perform. Most of the time you're not going to need every single hotkey on screen because you'll just be clicking and dragging and performing your cut and then releasing. However, there may come a rare occasion in which you may need to draw a shape, press tab in order to bring it to live, maybe use B for the hotkey of bevel, press E to perform an extrusion, which will require that we get out of view and look at it. From here we can also press X in order to shift our type into something else. We can also see that there's a hotkey of H, that if you press H you can actually toggle your shape from being shaded to being just a wireframe display, which makes it easier to see what's going on when you're moving it around. We can also see other hotkeys of interest here, like alt scrolling to change your particular cutter, but also Shift F to flip the shape. But I just wanted to do a small note just letting users know that the hotkey list is available and we're always updating it to make sure that users are always able to get the most out of their Boxcutter experience. So using the example of a circle, if I were to just draw a circle and shift it to live, and maybe press Alt V and turn overlays back on, we could select this top face and control click mark in order to perform basically a reverse bevel. And that's kind of the origin of reverse bevel. We first set it up in Hops, and I'm happy to announce that the first level of reverse bevel has been added to Boxcutter. So right now it's exclusive to Box. So if I switch over to Box, I can press J, which will turn it into a joint, but also offset it into the surface to avoid any sort of issues with it not penetrating with the surface. So now if we press B, we are beveling, and if we press Q, we are Q beveling. Normally you can press the hotkey of Shift F to flip a shape vertically. However, in this case here, since we have a cube with a Q bevel, if we press Shift F, we basically will give it a reverse bevel. So I'll tab to pause it, and we'll just move the bottom up ever so slightly just to ensure that we get a nice transition with the surface. It's always good to be aware of exactly what you're going to give this with it when it comes to transition, because otherwise you can open up some geometric hurt, of course. So let's click, and we now have this piece down. So I'll just turn on snapping, and we'll jump off this point, holding Alt, and bring down this piece on the inside, press B to bevel. Q bevel is still on from our last setting, so we can actually press B to jump into bevel and press Q to turn it off. So now it's basically good to go. We can press spacebar, and that is how you would perform a reverse bevel inside of Boxcutter. So here I am in Blender 2.83.12 using 717.17, which is last week's Boxcutter. So if we just start drawing a box and we press V in order to perform an array, we can just array and then click, and we're in a pause mode, right? However, if I press V, there will be a jump, and this jump annoys me to no end. We've done a lot of work with Array V2 on the hop side to prevent this sort of jump from happening in this state that I refer to as resume. Whenever you resume a modifier, there should not be a jump. You should just be there, frozen in space, able to deliberate on what you want to do next. So I'll show you once again. I press V and it just jumps, and this jump is probably not needed. So let's now jump over to the latest version of Blender. So now I will just draw a box. Let's make sure we have the right piece selected, and we will just press V. Whenever array is out of control and you can't find it, Shift R will bring it back. In fact, if you look at the hotkeys on the side, Shift R is one of the hotkeys listed whenever it comes to array. So if you're a big array user, it's important to be aware of that. So here I am with an array paused. Also could use a guidance line down the middle to ease with shading, but that's a talk for another day. If I were to press V, we're there. We're in array again. We can move the mouse to begin adjusting it. However, the moment that you pause it, you should be able to just stop and look at it and admire it, and also be able to press V and stop and look at it and admire and deliberate on your count and deliberate on your distance before you even have to begin moving to begin making adjustments again. So while I know there's a long road ahead for making Array and Boxcutter catch up to our Hops counterpart, we are taking steps towards rectifying some of the issues that you may have heard me complaining about in previous content. So recapping Array, whenever you're drawing a shape, you can press V to array, and of course move the mouse in order to adjust the distance. However, if you end up in a situation where the array is out of control, you can always press Shift R to basically bring it back under control, to basically reset it. In the event that you just want to flip array, you can just press F during array and it will flip the array. So in the event that you just want to put it on the other side, you can just flip it, and if you ever lose control, remember that pressing Shift R will bring it back to somewhere a little more sane. So general Boxcutter use is you click and drag to create your shape. When you release, you're able to then begin the extrusion process. I'm using Boxcutter 717.17, so I don't have the extrusion lock, so it feels a little weird. However, once you click, the operation is complete. We introduced an option called release lock, where whenever you have it enabled, it actually breaks the operation into steps. So you can click and drag to create your 2D shape. You can take a moment to just look around it. You can even shift, click, and drag the center dot in order to move it around. You can drag the blue dot in order to go from a chamfer, bring it in, turn it into a bevel, bring it back out, turn it into a chamfer, drag this dot and perform the extrusion, and then click and apply. So it's a more step-based process for people who want to just step through the operations. However, shift clicking it also opens up a expansive subpalette where we added an option called repeat lock. Whenever repeat lock's on, that means that whenever you draw a shape, so I'm drawing just a center drawn shape here, and now whenever I repeat, it will drop that shape in a state that's paused. So I can actually shift drag this dot in order to move the shape around. I could repeat this again, shift drag this dot in order to reposition it. I could repeat here, shift drag this dot to reposition it, just because I dropped it into this kind of pause mode whenever I did repeat. So it comes in handy for times where you want to do something like this. It's a little strange with the transform of this dot. I'll have to check into that. But whenever you're repeating like this and it's paused, you can also do things like, say, rotate and press G, move it over, press V, array it, and do all the things you would normally do with a piece of paused geometry. However, the thing about repeat lock is that once you use it repeatedly in 2.93, it would actually deselect your current selection. So this is something that I'm unable to replicate here, so it's actually making me look like a fool. However, if we jump over to the latest version of Blender, I'm also happy to announce that repeat lock is no longer a situation with us having the mesh get deselected. You might have saw it in my previous demo, but now if I were to come in and repeat this, we see that while it's able to repeat fine and dandy, it's also coming in and keeping the mesh selected, which is an important thing for repeating fluidly over and over without any sort of issue standing in the way, like you having to stop and double click to select something. In fact, there's not even a need for me to work with repeat lock on, since I'm working in such a linear fashion. I could actually just keep double clicking and keep adding repeat points at this point. So repeat is one of those things that we started improving over the last version. It continues getting better. Also, before we move on to the next thing from repeat, one more thing. So I'm going to press Control Z until I undo all the cuts that I made, and I'm just back at the first one that I started with. And we'll select this point and this point, press J to put a vert in between in edit mode. We'll press Alt V and turn on wireframe just so we can see our wireframe. And now what I want to do is turn off grid and use snap dots in order to repeat precisely in this area. Just placing one of these parts in between, but just letting you know that we also now support orientation modes, which is part of Shift V. In fact, whenever you're using certain things like dots will now take advantage of nearest edge if you're precisely on top of an edge, even if you're inside of local, really expanding its usefulness a bit. In fact, you can see that the more shapes I add, I have quite a few dots on screen, and they're also a little large, but that's something that's adjustable in preferences, but we'll be going more over that later. So alternatively, if I were to try that same thing on this edge, we can see that the repeat stroke is actually aligned to it as well. Just double clicking and waiting for it to appear. And just like that, we can continue subdividing inside of an edge with repeat. However, in the future, I do hope that we are able to add subdivision to dots, but that's a talk for another day. So with that, we can now jump on to the next section. In the previous version of Blender, along with the previous version of Boxcutter, let's try that same thing with getting it to orient. So we just perform the same edge across, and I'll press Shift V and we'll set this to nearest edge. And the first thing I'll do is draw a box, but I'll hold Alt so I get center draw. And then we'll press spacebar, and let's activate snapping and just control click. And we see that while it also deselected because of the rotation lock, or the repeat lock, let's turn that off. We also see that it wasn't able to orient it to this edge, even though we had it set to nearest edge. In fact, if we Shift V and jumped it over to longest edge, we see that none of these settings actually take effect, and really is the responsibility of the dot to provide the rotation information for the repeat that we're doing here. So this is precisely what we're trying to fix from what we were showing in the last slide. When it comes to frontal cuts, we've always left it up to the user to either draw their cut and just click to perform a laser cut, in which you'll attempt to cut through the mesh, or you can click and drag and just leave it like so. And then when you rotate the view, you're able to basically perform the depth part of your extrusion. If you're working in a non-frontal view, you're able to just draw and then move the mouse in order to perform your extrusion, which is pretty much the preferred way to work when it comes to working inside of Boxcutter. However, sometimes you want to work from just a frontal axis and just be very quick and just cut through the mesh. In fact, it's important to remember that if you're hovering over the mesh, you're going to draw on surface, while if you draw off of the mesh, it's going to do something called view align. And you can see that in the top where the bar goes and says view. Now whenever I click, I'm performing a view align cut, which allows me to cut all the way through the mesh. And on surface, I can just draw it, and then if I just click, it will perform the laser cut operation as well. However, when it comes to defining any sort of depth that's either all the way through or nothing, there's no way to really do that in the current version of Boxcutter 717 unless you rotate your view and move the mouse in order to perform your extrusion. This is something that we sought to change over the course of this next update. So here I am inside of Boxcutter 717.18, and if we draw a box, we can now move the mouse in order to perform an extrusion and control how much depth it's actually getting. The only way you can really visually tell how much depth is happening is through the assistive hops cutter notification here. That's part of HardOps, but is built to assist Boxcutter as well. And we see that as I'm moving the mouse, I'm able to cut all the way through. And you see that even though I'm continuing to move the mouse, I'm not able to cut any further. And that is because there is an extrusion lock in place now, thanks to the power of Accucut, where basically we won't allow you to just shoot this out in space from a frontal axis, because you really don't have any idea how far you're shooting it out aside from numeric values. So in order to see it in action, we could press tab, and that will pause the shape, and then when we middle mouse button move, we can actually see exactly how far this is cut. So anytime you perform a view-based extrusion, it's always going to attempt to constrain itself to the bounds of the form in order to ensure that you get something that's a little bit controllable. Sometimes whenever you have your cutters be far too long, it results in strange dots when it comes to hops tools. So I will just stretch this out, and we'll just set the origin to this location and then just get rid of it. So if I were to Alt-W switch over to hops tool and we try to look for the dot for this cutter, we see that the cutter is somewhere very strange out in space. So if I had to recall this cutter, it would be a very nuanced and annoying process, because the cutter isn't actually located anywhere recognizable. So if I were to just Control Z to bring all that back, and we attempted that again, we now see that our cutter dot is located somewhere near the actual vicinity of the object that we're cutting into. So there's a lot of reasons behind it, is to try to get these systems to connect up very nicely without a whole lot of issue. But just letting you know that we've taken some steps towards being able to draw in front and then drag the cursor in order to control how much depth you're actually giving. So you still can just draw and then click in order to perform a laser cut. But if you want to give it depth, you would just draw and then move the cursor, and then you can actually see it giving it depth in action. In fact, in addition to all of this, there's a control accelerator where in your preferences of the behavior panel under input, there's now something called control factor. So I'll right click this and set it back to its default value, which apparently I just can't do in this area, but the default value is actually 5. And this means that whenever I hold control, it will actually accelerate the value by 5 that the mouse is giving it. So I'll just draw a circle and I'll just hold control, and when I move it, just notice how I'm not even very far off the shape before I'm already cutting through, and then I just click and that operation has been completed. So just letting you know that in the event that you're trying to cut something that's even larger than your current form, using view extrusion, which I'm hoping will catch on with users, all you have to do is just increase your control factor, and then you'll be able to draw even further than normal, because we still don't have 3D capabilities yet added to Boxcutter's measurement system for mouse vectors or something like that. Don't get me started. So here we are setting it to 50, and I will just click, and drag, and you see me attempting to cut through using the system that we have already, and it's just not going to make the cut all the way through both of these boxes. But if I hold control, I'm now able to cut all the way through. So letting you know that even when it comes in terms of cutting in very large spaces just using view, you're able to do that. I mean, it's really kind of a waste just using it to jump all the way to what would normally be given to us by laser cut. But we see here that laser cut just didn't do the job because of the multi-mesh situation. In fact, that time it did. But all right, maybe it's fine now. Sometimes there's a fluke that'll have me going back to the labs reporting issues, but now you know that there's now an extrude from depth parameter added to Boxcutter, and that's how you would use it. Previously in 717_17, we were celebrating victories for improvements that were being done with alignment and orientation. However, internally I knew that there was much work to be done, and we were still working quite hard on getting orientation solved in an adequate manner. So when it comes to orientation, normally something called local is the default, which we can see here. Whenever you're using local, it will just orient the shapes according to what is set locally. In fact, if I rotate it, I'm still able to draw on this shape locally. This is basically the meaning of local for us. Whenever it comes to Boxcutter, I'll reset its location. If I were to select this point and press J to put a point in between, like a lightning bolt, and enable wireframe, we can now jump over to nearest edge. And for this, I have snap dots enabled, which means that if I hold control, I now see snap dots. And if I were to draw based off of this dot, we see that I'm now able to draw based off of this middle edge. And this is one of the benefits of our orientation system that we've been working on. In fact, you can press Shift V to bring up your orientation helper anytime in order to override the type of orientation that's being used. For example, I could go back to local, and if I jump off this dot, we see that I'm now back local with this object. However, nearest is one of my favorites. So we will just start with nearest, and we'll create this cut, perform a bevel, and that's the cut. And if I were to start with this edge, because this edge is nearby, of course I will be orienting to this edge as well. So orientation's always been a bit of a thing. However, it's also been a bit of a mystery that I've wanted to elaborate on and make a little more clear for users. So let's talk about where the system breaks down. Let's change this back to local. We talked about dots. We talked about how you can just jump off of dots in order to just put shapes in the center of things. I mean, I didn't jump off that dot right, but here I am using these dots in order to begin jumping off. Of course, holding Alt in order to draw from to draw from center. However, in the event that you want to draw in a way that's not constrained to corner, you could always press period, and period will allow you to draw a center drawn box, and then you can just use Alt to modify it and use it as a rectangle like you see me doing here. However, we'll just use it as a box. If we were to take this box and press R and rotate it, this box's world has been turned upside down. And what this means is that if we were to use local, it works fine with orientation, but if we use dots, it does not work fine. If we were to press Shift V and we go to nearest edge, we will try to jump off of this edge, and we see that this is completely wrong and it's disastrous and it's not going to work out. And if we go with this edge, we see this also the same situation. If I zoom back and I take this cube up and out into space, R twice, just to rotate it a whole bunch, just really getting jiggy with it, we see that things are just not what they seem, and every system just breaks down in a very ugly fashion. And this is one of the first things that we were discussing the moment that the release was over. It's like, we gotta solve this ish immediately, guys. In fact, we gotta solve this good. We gotta solve it hard. We gotta solve it for good. We gotta solve this for good. And so that was the theme of this release. So now, minimizing this, we're back in Boxcutter. And we were talking previously about how you have local, nearest, and longest as your orient methods. And not being aware of these can result in a rather bad time. So if you're not aware, just keep it under local. Just keep it simple. However, if you're watching this video, you're about to become an advanced user. So we'll do the same thing. We'll select our cube. We'll select each of these points, press J, just to put a point between. And if we hold Control and we hover over it, we see that we're able to draw, of course, locally. we should expect local. One of the contemplations I had was adding local somewhere in the top bar to be more indicative of the particular state. However, we'll have to come back for that. I don't want to trash the top bar without giving it a bit of deep thought. So let's just press Shift V and use our orientation helper to turn on nearest edge. And here we are able to use our nearest edge in order to extrude, and we also see that the auto extrude limiter will grab you, and that's just a thing now. If it becomes a problem, we can add, of course, parameters to turn it off. However, over the course of testing, we found that it did more harm than good, and we couldn't actually run into a whole lot of situations that justified its removal or even its mitigation. So continuing on, so now we're oriented to this, and that's all stuff that I showed you previously. So let's just take this cube, double R, rotate it twice. Nearest is now over here. Let's just begin doing what we were doing. So we see that orientation is still working fine. And this is actually what this particular release was all about. We see that this one did not work fine. So I wonder what's going on there. Let's just open this up and check what we have. We could jump to local, which will allow us to perform the cut. However, I'm of the opinion that nearest edge actually should have performed the orientation proper. So this is something that we can actually come back to and discuss when it comes to grid. However, let's actually change this over to longest edge and attempt to draw the shape. And we see that now it's been drawn previously. There was previously a video that I put up called Box Corner Study that was just me cutting the corner of a box, playing with all the orientation modes. And the point of that video was actually to come to the conclusions that we're talking about here today about what each orientation method equals to us and what we can do to improve it and how it falls short and what we can do to make it more clear what you're oriented to. Because right now you see me cutting, I'm cutting kind of blind. I'm able to make these cuts work even at this strange orientation, but I'm not truly aware of what my orientation is being set to until I begin drawing the shape. In fact, here I'm drawing the shape. I didn't know where it was going to orient. I figured it would have oriented to this line that I'm nearby, but unless I press Shift V and I turn on nearest edge, that's not going to be the case. Now that's nearest edge, but if I draw over here, still using nearest edge. I draw over here, no longer using nearest edge, but if I draw over here, also not using the nearest edge that I would have been anticipating using. In fact, I have to be somewhere kind of close to this particular piece in order to get the orientation that I desire. And this is actually where orientation still breaks down, but we have done a lot of work towards improving it for this particular update. So I'm just going to take this shape. I was going to say take this tape. We'll just take this shape, bring it up in space, rotate it. And the reason that I'm doing all this rotating and transforming is because this is how I've been testing it. Every time we do an update internally, the first thing I do is show them me taking this shape up in space and cutting it in the most transform situation just to show exactly what it is that we're aiming to solve. So here I'll press D, change over to box, and we're drawing, I guess, using either longest edge or local right now. And we don't even want to cut down that deep, and I don't want to cut that edge out because we still need it for the testing that we're doing. So if I press Shift V, we can change this to nearest edge, which actually should have picked up this nearest edge. And we see that, you know, there's something off with our operation here. In fact, Shift V again, change this to longest edge, and now we're able to play off of this. So there's always been this small guessing game whenever it comes to understanding if you're able to exactly extrude in this, or if you're able to exactly orient to this particular edge, or if it's going to grab the next edge. The calculation system has always been a little bit more random, so our work has been to try to bring a little bit more sanity to it. So the purpose of this was to talk about how there's been orientation improvements, but with that, we can now move on to the next section talking about grid improvements. To understand grid, you must first understand snapping. And to understand snapping, you must also understand orientation. We talked about orientation previously, where if you press Shift V, you can have your object parameters show you what your orient method is. And so if you're messing around under longest edge or nearest edge, you might get a rather unpredictable result because local is our default. But just letting you know that for the following, these parameters will also tie in with it. So being aware of you being in local is essential. So the first component of snapping is dots. By activating the magnet, Dots are normally activated by default as well. There's a small subpanel at the end of the snap panel where you can choose whether you have vert, edge, or face dots. And this rotation angle is actually pertaining to the rotation whenever you press R for a shape. You can either rotate it at 15-degree increments or something smaller like 5 or something larger like 90 or whatever custom value you set up. So now by holding control, you'll see these dots appearing on the surface, which are now orientation dots. And just by choosing one, while I hover over it, I can just begin drawing my shape based off of it. Normally you draw starting from corner, but if I hold Alt, I can trigger center draw. And if I hold Alt plus Shift, I can use center plus square, which gives us an equidistant basic box. However, instead of holding all those keys, you can also press period, and that will just change your draw type to be a center draw, allowing you to just perform your extrusion. You might notice that whenever I perform the extrusion, instead of extending off the object, it hard stops at the end. This is new to this particular update, and something users will have to be acquainted with, but should allow you to get better form-fitting booleans when it comes to your box rather than overextending them outside into space unnecessarily, trying to cut down on boolean waste. So we'll click and apply, and that's how you would basically use a face dot. When it comes to an edge dot, it's much the same. We're just hovering over this dot, starting off, clicking and dragging, and then holding Alt in order to change our draw type to what I like to call a spring box, and we'll just bring down our cut, and just like that we have used that particular aspect of snapping as well. So vert is the most controversial part of Boxcutter, I feel, because using vert is so easy to create what I call a hotline, which will result in geometric or Boolean shading issues. In fact, back in the day, we used to take special care to rotate the circle ever so slightly in order to prevent vert from having an issue with this particular type of cut, because it would be so easy to get an edge to line up precisely with this edge and thus cause Boolean shading issues, resulting in support emails. But just like that, that is snapping in a nutshell. The next level of snapping is grid. So by clicking the icon next to the magnet, you can activate grid, and by hovering over the surface, you will now be able to draw a grid. By rolling the wheel, you'll be able to adjust the scale, so we can scale the grid down to something very small, or roll the wheel up in order to get it to something very large. I might have rolled it a little hard there, and I did. So we'll need to bring that back to decent levels. But just know that the grid is something that you're able to adjust on the fly. And just like I'm tapping control to read these surfaces, you're also able to take the grid and extend it off just by default. So I'll switch it to something like box, allowing me to basically start with my grid out here, taking the surface that I started with, and then being able to draw a shape that largely starts off the mesh and then meets with it at some point and then cuts into it. So it's just an interesting way to work, but was one of the goals that we set out with when it came to Boxcutter. So there have been some improvements with grid over the course of this version, so I'll be going over them, but I wanted to just kind of give a basic indicator about how grid works. So in a nutshell, just like that, you can now either set dots or grid to be your snapping medium, and just immediately begin either drawing oriented to a grid system that's able to go on to infinity, or a dot system that I plan to have expanded further down the road, hopefully. Previously in Boxcutter, if you had both grid enabled but also dots, they would show up together. So right here on a cube, it's not so bad. You're like, hey, what's the big deal about having dots and the grid? Well, if we were to go in edit mode, right, and take knife tool and really just give this thing a raking, then we can actually see some much different dots than what you would normally expect. Not saying that your geo would look like this. This looks more like something that would happen after a ninja technique. But now we see that there's all these additional dots on the surface, and they're not actually useful to us. In fact, normally dots reveal themselves as you get closer, but that's not the case with grid. In fact, you see that whenever I turn grid off, the dots actually reveal themselves as I get into their vicinity. But with grid, it's only going to keep the dots with the current state. And really, you can only snap the first part of the shape to it. I can't even snap the shape to the secondary dot. So for that reason, dots were always a bit of a logic error to have as a part of grid, and were just kind of useless. In fact, even if you were able to snap to these particular dots, like the vert dot, you would only get a sort of geometric heartbreak we like to call the hotline, which is good for nobody. So for that reason, grid and dots no longer will show together. If it becomes a problem, we can always, of course, add a parameter to bring it back in the future. However, over the course of testing, we did not find a need for it to be present. So now we're here over in the latest version of Boxcutter 717.18, and we have dots enabled and we have grid enabled, and we see that now grid is able to be just a grid without any sort of interference from outside elements, and we can just turn grid off and go back to using classic dots, or turn grid on and go back to being grid. However, I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you'll be more about using a grid than you were about using dots. So when it comes to orientation methods in grid, we were talking about how you can select one point, select another point, and press J to pretty much draw an edge in between them. And using Boxcutter, you can set something like nearest edge and draw a shape actually orienting to the nearest edge. So we need to reveal our wireframe, but you can see the nearest edge to where my drawing is beginning. And this is kind of our attempt at creating a sort of orientation system. However, when it comes to grid does not take these orientation systems into play. So that means if I were to draw a shape based off of this, we're going to get something that's not going to orient to the grid exactly as we would hope. In fact, really to utilize the grid in this particular situation, a grid would need to actually be rotated towards this edge that I'm moving my mouse down. So here we see that the grid's actually oriented correctly, but in this case, I would not consider this actually oriented correctly. Another type of test that I like to do is bring in a plane, and I will just bring one edge out and another one like so, and then just cut a line in between. So this is definitely our longest edge, and this one's definitely our nearest edge. So that means if I were to enable wireframe and we went in and just activated box, we can of course draw here, and we see that our grid's not able to line up here, and we're able to draw near here. Even if we were to choose longest edge, we could continue to draw. Actually, because of this one terminating it shortly, this is no longer the longest edge. Now it's the longest edge. So it's things like that, like the type of guesswork that would have to be associated with orientation to be able to knowingly be aware of your orientation. So because of that, we wanted to improve that in this version. First things first was definitely getting the grid to orient with the nearest, longest, and local system. So jumping over to the latest version. So here we are back in latest, and I'll just select 2 points and press J and press Shift V to look at our orientation, and we're set to local. Let's change it to nearest edge, and I'm going to activate grid, and that's all it takes. So now the grid is oriented to this nearest edge. Now the grid's located on this nearest edge. Now it's oriented to this nearest edge, and now it's oriented to this nearest edge. And that's really as simple as it gets when it comes to this latest update. We wanted to try to simplify the system to be something that users would be able to understand and grasp pretty easily. And you know, our goal has always been to try to figure out what the goal is and accomplish that, rather than try to just be exactly like everyone else. So you know, I get a lot of chatter all the time about asking if we would ever pursue adding some sort of static, more contemporary style grid, and the answer of course is going to be no, because I'm just not trying to look exactly like everyone else. So when it comes to grid, you definitely have to have your cursor very near to the edge that you intend to align to in order to grab that alignment point. So that's something that I did not know when I was doing that Boxcutter corner demo. I didn't know that I had to actually just be right up on the edge in order to grab it and have that as my kind of normal area for me to work off of. So like if I wanted to work next to this thing, I would have to mouse it there, because if I do it somewhere else, it's going to orient more than likely to something even closer to the cursor. So if I want to even work in accordance with this area, I could just hover very close, scroll it down, and just like that, I'm able to orient to that very easily using our grid. I can hover over this edge, get the same area, draw a shape, just like that, no problem. I can grab this face, scroll down, bring it in, and just like that, I'm able to continue orienting without having to think about changing any parameters or bring up any options or values to change. Just being able to do it all on the fly and just hovering over something, selecting it, and being able to draw a shape and automatically orient it is exactly what this release is all about. When it comes to Boxcutter, you can also use it in edit mode, and that's where our normal grid orientation improvements also extend. So if we tap into edit mode, we can select these 2 points and just create a line across, just like before. And notice that I'm already in destructive mode and edit mode, which is just one of my favorite ways to work. And so if we go to our orientation panel, we see that we're under local. We'll change this to nearest edge, and with a deselection, we can now tap control with our grid and now it's going to actually orient to the particular area that we are hovering over. So even in edit mode, this type of stuff is now supported. However, for a moment I had to tap out of edit mode and go back in, so I'm not sure what that was about, but just in case you do have issues, just know that you can always go in and out of edit mode in order to sort of bring some sanity back to it. So tapping back into edit mode, I'm now hovering over this edge. I'll hold control, roll the wheel down to bring it down real small, and we'll just draw a little square here, orient it to a particular area, maybe press G to move it around, click and apply, and just like that we're able to orient to this area. You can also use active edge as your orientation system, so if we turn that on, now whenever you draw a grid, it's always going to be oriented to the edge that you have selected, unless you're off the mesh, in which case you're going to be using view align. But notice that even over here I'm still drawing oriented to the edge that's selected, so grid also supports that as well, which was not there previously. Previously active edge only supported just your orientation for whenever you did a box draw, but now whenever you use it when it comes to grid, you can also use it to correct its initial positioning as well. So we'll just select this edge, get our grid position, and just like that we can continue working in edit mode. In fact, let's say I wanted to begin working at this particular angle. Well, now I can select this edge, my grid's now oriented to this angle, and I can just keep working. Of course, I need to maintain my selection in order to keep my orientation, but that's fine. Since I'm working in destructive, it gets a little bit sticky, but just like that, I'm able to continuously repeat my grid in this area and continuously make cuts through this without any sort of issue, just using the orientation system along with the improvements that have been made with grid for edit mode. So just letting you know that no matter where you are in Blender as far as object mode or edit mode, we do take these settings even more into consideration. So just keep in mind, if you're using a mode that's different than local, that it may affect your ability to get the grid to show up exactly the way that you want. But if you take advantage of it, you can use nearest edge to just really get a grid that's exactly the way you want when you want it. For example, I'm trying to get this area. It appeared that I had to really hover over that edge just to pick that particular area for me to offset just slightly to create this particular cut. So just to show how limited these sort of aspects were in Boxcutter 717.17, our last release, my new favorite punching bag, I'm just going to take this cube, rotate it a couple of times, really get those transforms wacky in every way possible. Tap in edit mode, we'll select two areas and just make an edge. And we'll just Alt W, start Boxcutter, and we'll change it to nearest edge. And we'll just turn on wireframe as well. And we see that we're not able to really get the grid to really position up to anything. Even in edit mode, we're not able to get the grid to position up to our selection. So it was kind of a bit of a kind of missing area that needed to be filled in. But in addition to that, even if we were to turn grid off and use dots, we weren't able to actually use dots properly either. And at first we attributed this to the orientation system. However, it appeared to affect every orientation system, where you would just get these undesirable results on transform states. I'm surprised that no user reported this. However, one user did report it, pointing it out to us and finally showing us that it's finally high time for us to get this orientation business in check. So I'm actually going to Control-C copy this. Now we're over in 2.93 running current, so I'll press Control-V just to paste that object and then use numpad period to find it out in space. And so even though this object's been transformed so heavily, in fact, we can scale it just to make it even weirder, you know, just one more level of weird, so everything's just off. We can now hover over it, press Alt-V, turn on wireframe, and we're still able to orient to the areas that we are wanting. In fact, right here, I don't know if the calculation system for that is correct. Let's try applying the scale, and we see that now it's actually oriented correctly. So when it comes to scale corrections, there's still some improvement to be had, but just letting you know that even if you have your shape transformed all the way out in space, that's something that we're able to work with. So I'm just going to press SZZ in order to scale it, turn off grid, and we'll just use our dots. And notice that even with the shape transformed, I'm able to use our dots in order to perform an extrusion. Our extrusion nicely locks on the other side, which I can guarantee will take some time to get used to, but in the end will result in less offshooting booleans just flying out in space. And just like that, we're able to continue on cutting this box even though it's in a highly transformed state. So just like that, that issue has been resolved, aside from scale, which I feel we will more likely be revisiting in the future. Long ago, I asked that view align be hacked in as a sort of grid because there was no grid for view align, there was just view align. And when I talk about view align, I'm talking about the alternative of drawing on the surface. Right here, I will click and drag and I'm drawing on top of the surface. But if I click and drag off of the surface, I'm performing what's called a view align cut. In fact, at the top of the screen, you can see where it's gone red, letting me know that surface has been overridden with view, and now we're drawing in accordance with view because there is no surface for us to catch. And that's really the basics of surface draw versus view align. If we were to click on the grid's now active, and we can now have a grid to draw on the surface. Just like I've been showing in previous content, you could just use a grid to just work away. However, if you were to hold control out in space without anything around, you're not going to see a grid. The thing about grid in the previous versions of Boxcutter was you had to actually activate view and then hover over the mesh in order to trigger a view align grid. And another caveat of the view align grid is that you don't see any dots on this grid. It's just a grid in form and fill, but nothing else, not even in function. So that means that if we click and drag, there's a degree of inaccuracy when it comes to our relationship with these dots. And so whenever I click, it results in us getting a sort of inaccurate cut. However, it's still a view align cut. And whenever it comes to view align, there really weren't a lot of options for it. So this is something that we wanted to resolve with the latest version of Boxcutter. So here we are now enabling grid and enabling view. And even if the mouse doesn't start on the mesh, you just hold control and you now have grid dots. And we can go in here and just begin drawing and press control again and bring it up once again. And you might notice that I'm losing the grid after every operation, and this is in order to prevent other issues that could happen with the grid, like it tracking to areas of the surface that are no longer there, which was a previous issue. But we'll be talking more about how to keep a grid on screen for longer than a second very shortly. But I just wanted to show that view align now has a proper grid with proper snap points, thus bringing to life a system that I thought would never truly ever become a thing. In fact, you can see that because I'm using view as an override, surface isn't even going to be triggered whenever I begin drawing on the surface. But just letting you know that grid has now been improved to be even better than ever, and now supporting surface align across all of our tools. I'm just holding control and clicking and dragging, and it should actually make a little more sense to users of control and even users that aren't using control. So just like that, we're able to extrude it through, and I will just perform a click in order to complete that operation. And we'll trigger the alignment grid one more time to perform one last cut and hold control to really accelerate it. And just like that, view align grid has now been improved in Boxcutter 717.18. In the last update log to Boxcutter 717.17, we talked about how repeat had been improved. However, in this update, we wanted to improve the visualization of repeat, but also improve its relationship with grid. So here I am in the previous version of Boxcutter in 283.12, and we'll just begin drawing our shape, and we'll press B to bevel that, and we'll bring up our grid. And notice that every time I repeat, a little small square appears before the second click. This was something that kind of irked me in the last demo, and was one of the things I pretty much complained about immediately after recording. It was like, hey, is there something we could do about this square? Because the square is sometimes bigger than the shape that I'm repeating, and I feel that it might throw people off. It doesn't seem very natural. Why is there a square there? Can't we replace it with possibly something else, like nothing, or maybe a dot? So here I am just going through and attempting to continuously repeat. You can see a few booleans breaking down, but more than likely that's either due to hot lines or using the fast algorithm where I'm probably cutting precisely on top of another edge. But this was kind of one of the ways that I would go about testing the power of repeat to make sure that repeat is exactly as good as we are saying that it is, by showing that even in a situation where normally you'd probably be smarter to use an array, you could also use repeat in a very procedural fashion, except for a few areas here, like right there, where we just don't have the cutter. So let's actually go in here and take a look at this, maybe scale it up a little bit take a look at our cutter. Maybe we just need to put a weld on it and we're good to go. In fact, let's find the other one that didn't work out. This one, why didn't this one work out? Maybe we can increase the weld amount. Nope. Let's Alt V, look at the wireframe and troubleshoot, and we see that more than likely we are creating either a hotline or we're part of one. So I'm just going to scale it until it shows up. Sometimes it's very fickle. However, since I'm in 2.83, I don't have access to Boolean options for the fast or exact algorithm, or else I would just change the algorithm and that's how I would get to go through. But you get the point with how repeat would show a small shape every time it's done. That would be somewhat distracting. So in the latest update, we sought to improve that. So here we are, and I'm just going to turn off view grid, and we'll start off using this point. And I'm just going to hold Alt and we'll just turn it into a little divot. Whenever you use center draw, it allows you to repeat also using center draw. We also want to be mindful of our orientation mode. Here's a case where orientation just didn't work out for us. Immediately I could tell that it wasn't local. We turned it back to local and everything's back sane, except for the part where we need to draw our shape also in local on the grid in order for it to repeat on local on the grid. So here we are now repeating the shape all the way down. This is a test that I would do several times a day just to make sure that repeat is exactly as good as we say it is. In fact, I actually did one of these where I worked an entire set of repeats in the shape of a Boxcutter logo all the way across a cube. However, I'll spare you guys that demo today. In fact, right there we had a little bit of a hiccup. So what we'll need to do is probably grab one of our cutters, switch over to custom cutter, press C to make it the custom cutter, and we will just draw that in and continue on and pretend that we did not have to replace our shape with a custom cutter redrawn variant for a section of this. So I just want to go all the way down and work my way back up just to confirm that repeat is looking good. So continuing on, just holding control, double clicking. You can see my keystrokes in the corner, nothing to it. One more to go and goal. So with that, we have now confirmed that repeat is now looking better than ever, aside from a small snafu that came up over the course of it in the middle with the little box down there, but that's something I'll be checking over afterwards. One of our oldest complaints with the grid is that if you were to press D and switch over to say like NPanel, right, and you have grid up and you're drawing on grid, but for some reason you decide to release control for whatever reason, your mother called on the phone, you got to answer, or DoorDash is at the door, you know, you got to order a pizza, whatever the case is, you release control, the grid will not show back up. And that's because the grid is only there for you at the beginning of the operation as long as you're holding control. So if you are holding control the whole time, you'll be able to continue to have the grid up, but that's a bit of a constraint on the user. As you know, I'm not a big fan of holding keys down for extended periods of time. That's almost as bad as pressing the hotkey a million times. So improvements have been made in that regard as well. So here we'll just have our grid up, no special settings required. And if we begin drawing on our grid, we let go of control just to do whatever it is that we have to do for today. If we pick back up with control, we're back to snapping with grid. However, we may want to backspace a couple of points in order to grid snap properly and keep our rhythm going. But just like that, now you can release control and press control to bring back your grid on the fly even while you're working. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, in the previous versions there was this option called increment lock, where basically by activating it you could activate increment lock, where basically you would draw snap to increments, and even when you extruded you would extrude to these increments, which wasn't really the smartest idea in my opinion, because you know, being able to extrude to a preset snap depth would result in your ability to also hotline a lot easier. And so without using a later version of Blender that has optimizations for these sort of booleans, you can see that by overlapping things with a similar Z depth that it just causes boolean issues. To show how you could actually rectify that in the later version of Blender, I'm just going to copy all those objects and bring them over. And just by going under the HardOps button, we can use the Boolean helper to change these over to exact. And we see that under exact, you're able to get a little bit farther, but the option of increment lock just didn't make a whole lot of sense. So it's now been extended into something called grid lock. So by turning it on, that means that now you can tap control and the grid will remain on screen. And when you rotate the view, the grid is still there, tracing to the same surface. So basically you can just continue drawing on the exact same surface using the same grid. In fact, it looks like the capabilities of having it remain across draws ended up not making it because it was probably compromising to another one of the systems that we'll be talking about. However, being able to just tap control and ray trace a surface and then just draw however you want and bring it back over is definitely going to be something that users will be getting attached to. However, whenever it comes to using this mode, the key thing to keep in mind is that when grid lock is active, the icon up top where snap grid is will change. So if I tap control, you can see that the icon area is now darker. That's your only indication at this time that grid lock is active. So if I were to roll the cursor off the screen, it's kind of hard for me to actually get the grid out of sight. But just know that anytime that you have grid lock active, you could just press escape and that will actually drop it so you can redraw it on the surface. Another thing about grid lock is that you can press control in order to retrace another surface. So this is something that's really handy for just kind of reading what you're about to be orienting to and perfecting your orientation before you even get to the draw phase, which if you were watching the corner box demo, every time I wanted to troubleshoot my orientation, I had to draw a box. So just letting you know that this is something that can also be done just via grid itself. So to show this in action, I will visual geometry to mesh, select these two, press J, and we could just press Shift V and change this over to nearest edge. So here we are with nearest edge. We press escape, we tap control here. We're now ray tracing to this area. And even with my grid being rolled off of the surface, without me even holding control, I'm able to click and drag and just bring my shape over and begin drawing at this preset orientation that's been grabbed from this nearest edge area. So just letting you know that there's even more possibilities for you to be able to work, but a very popular request was the ability to keep grid active even without having to hold down control. So I could press D, switch over to NPanel, just begin drawing my shape. Even though it's terrible off the surface, it doesn't matter, it's not penetrating the surface at that area, but I'm able to continue working and the grid will infinitely go without ever ceasing, which is one of the main goals that we set out for with this particular grid inside of Boxcutter. Was the idea of bounds was something that I didn't want to deal with, and also didn't want to deal with the idea of having a big work plane hitting me in the face all the time. So having something a little more transparent that you can get rid of and bring back and contour on the fly is something that spoke to a little bit more of my artistic sensibilities. In the future, hopefully we'll be adding support for something like subcells or something to be able to get fine even in the middle of your draw. But just letting you know, the steps have been taken to improve the capabilities with holding down control and having the grid just stick with what you're doing instead of having to hold down control all the time. Active Only is one of our earliest attempts at trying to get an orientation system inside of Boxcutter. The easiest way to showcase is to add a plane and press GZ1. And we could just bring this plane out, use the Q menu to turn it into a wireframe object. And we could even put a couple of subdivisions in it. And if we rotate it, we can now use this as a orientation surface for affecting this, but only if you go under the behavior panel and you turn on active only. Then the active only object is being used to orient. So let's make sure we're in the right orientation mode. And normally this is where active only would come in, and active only would allow you to cut only the secondary mesh, but you would use the orientation system of the first mesh. So it looks like over the course of 717.17, this aspect became broken and just wasn't even noticed. So let's now bring this back over here in the latest version, 717.18, and I'll select the grid, select the main object, and let's just turn on active only. And we see that now active only is performing the way it's supposed to, resolving a bug for one. But secondly, we can now use the grid oriented to the secondary object. So I'm just going to bring this grid out in space And now whenever I hold control, let's see which surface is it. Now we're able to trace it. So looks like it's not going to let me do it too far away from the surface. All right, so we select that, select this. Now we have our surface coming from the secondary object to the first object. And this is a small aspect of HardOps now because there's so many alternative and superior orientation methods, but doubling back to deal with local only is just one of those things. So now we'll orient the grid to this area. And this results in us having to bring down an even lower extrude than usual because we're a little bit elevated compared to the surface that we normally be trying to trace. But just like that, now you have active only support with grid in the new Boxcutter 717.18. Just another way to control your orientation whenever the going gets tough. Dots and their compatibility with our initial orientation systems has also been improved. So if we press Shift V, we can see that we're currently set to nearest edge. That means that if I select this point and press J to put an edge in between, that means whenever I snap using a dot, that it will snap using that nearest edge. And I can just override. And that means with this area that it should also snap to the nearest edge. Let's try it with this edge. And we see that it actually takes place on this side, but for some reason it did not take place on this side initially. Let's undo this, and we see that now it's actually working. Let's try it again. So now we're orienting to something else. You know, the orientation system's always so interesting because you never know exactly what you're going to get until you begin to draw, which is why integrating it with grid was actually so integral. For example, right here, I thought that I was going to get something much different, but instead this is the result that I received. So there's so many questions I have internally as far as how far the nearest reaches and whether we can have a circle that actually shows exactly what we're reaching for with this sort of thing. Like, I feel there's so much potential to be able to be brought out of this system once we dive in and understand and dissect what it actually is capable of. But at this time, it simply is but an experiment until we bring it into the level of sanity that users have come to expect from our tools. Here I am drawing another shape that, you know, which edge am I particularly aligning to? I just don't know. In fact, let's press Alt V, turn on wireframe, and I don't think I'm aligned to that one or that one or that one, because if I was aligned to that one, I wouldn't be experiencing that issue. However, just as a reminder, let's say that you were wanting to align a shape to this area, but actually draw, well, now it's making a fool out of me. Like, sometimes alignment, when it comes to nearest edge, will just work even in the range. Like, there's a chance that this cut won't work, that one won't work, that one will work, so I'll just press G and move it. But because I'm doing these cuts in the middle of faces, new edges are being created, which in turn are going to change the orientation systems depending on where I start. So in order to bring some sanity to this is where I would recommend using grid, since you are able to orient and then move it. You could even escape and repick your orientation selection and make further refinements. And I'm just pressing Control in order to recalculate as I'm moving around. Like, maybe I want to actually orient it perfectly to this edge, but not put it precisely on this edge and actually offset it. But just letting you know that dots now support local and nearest orientation in addition to longest, but also to really emphasize how you can get the most out of orientation and how it can be a little unusual depending on how you're evaluating the mesh. So right now I have snapping enabled, but I do not have grid enabled. So that means that I'm falling back to dots. Also, I'll turn off increment lock because that won't be needed for this. But basically I'm just going to be using snap dots. And if we hold Control, we now have dots whenever we hover over the mesh. And I just wanted to show how, as part of this release, part of the final mix of it, we did a little bit of graphical refinement to the dots to make them just a little bit more visible for users. If we were to transition to grid and look at it, we see that grid pretty much looks the same. and that even if you're working at a very small size, you should still be able to tell which dot that you're currently snapping to. And if we hold control off of the mesh, we can still see what dot we're snapping to there. Just letting you know that this is a visual change that only affects the snapping dots of the mesh itself. We're always seeking to improve things, even on the way of getting these releases out the door. We always see that there's just a little bit more that can be done even as we talk about it. So one of the ways that I like to test Boxcutter is I will select a vert, select another vert, press J, and from here I will make sure my orientation method is set to local, and I'm going to jump off this dot. And you notice that even though I'm using local, I'm being oriented to the nearest edge, which is one of the changes that have happened in this update. Now you'll be able to orient, even in local, to nearest edges. So this is something that we want to experiment with and see if it's something that's able to improve users' experiences with actually getting shapes aligned where they want them to be whenever they're using snapping dot systems. Another thing I want to talk about is how I test this tool. So let's Control Z, undo it. And what I'll do is I will zoom out very far and take my cube up in space, rotate it around a couple of times, zoom in, press Alt V, enable wireframe, and we see that we're quite far out in space with a strange rotation. And from here, I'll test the system of using local in order to capture nearest edge just whenever I'm using these dots. So this is something that may be different, but it's something that was probably needing to be done. One of the other things we're still in the process of negotiating is just having face and edge dots start you off in corner draw, mitigating the need of users to have to hold down Alt in order to start in the center, like you see me doing here. However, I just wanted to do a small section just talking about this particular test scenario and why I do it so much. While I'm still far out in space in the middle of nowhere, let's press Control Z a couple of times just to undo and take us back to the foundations. And I'm going to press SX and scale it. Scale is the more annoying one to deal with when it comes to orientation. Having unapplied scale just seems to wreak havoc on orientation. However, I'm happy to announce that part of this update, we also were able to get that resolved as well. So even if your object has unapplied scale, you should still be able to use local with dots in order to align things to nearest, giving you a slightly easier time whenever it comes to getting things aligned in Boxcutter. I always try to downplay performance improvements because I feel like people are always waiting to just test and come back and say that it's not working on their system. So right here I'm using dots with Boxcutter 717, and we can see that my cursor isn't able to be kept up with by the dots even though I'm moving at a relatively slow speed. So there was always some improvement that was able to be had when it came to dots. And I'm happy to announce that when it comes to this latest version, that the results are actually so noticeable that I just can't help but point it out. So now, thanks to some optimizations with the way that we deal with the sorting for the dot system, now dots should be able to pop up faster than ever, resolving an issue where dots would sometimes just hang a little bit as the going would get tough. When it comes to snap dots, having them of a certain size can look good with certain areas of the mesh. However, in areas where there's a very large geometric density, you may have issues with finding a very particular dot. So if we zoom in, we are now able to find the very particular dot that we're wanting. We're able to grab based on vert, edge, midpoint, or the next adjacent vertice. However, in the event that we wanted to deal with the way that it looks in this particular view, we can press F4, bring up our preferences, and underneath our preferences we can go under Boxcutter under display, and there's an option here for dot size. However, that's not the one that we want. The one that we want is snap dot size. So if we right click this, we can actually reset this to the default value, which is actually 5. So for my version, I actually have it enhanced a little bit just for the purposes of dramatic enhancement, but here we can see the dots actually showing up at 5 pixels, which when I initially saw it, I thought, while it does look a lot better, I thought that they looked a little bit small. So we could just press F4, go to preferences, and we'll just change this to say 8 under snap dot size. And now whenever we hold control, we have something that's a little bit easier to grab whenever it comes to snapping. Accucut started off as this idea for dealing with laser cut by providing some sort of limitation for clipping in order to prevent our boolean from overshooting the meshes so far. As we can see with this laser cut, the cut fits to the mesh. In fact, for the purposes of this, I'll draw the shape, but before extruding, I'll press L. So that way every shape I draw will draw to remain live. So we see that this shape remains live. If I draw this shape, it also remains live. And that's really the power of Accucut. The cool thing about Accucut is that if we were, say, to have both of these meshes selected, and we drew out a cut and clicked all the way through, we'll see that it's calculated to actually penetrate both shapes, depending on which one we have as our active selection. So it's always important to confirm your selection to make sure that you're not accidentally deselecting something else by accident. In fact, in this case, I see that there might be an automatic deselection of secondary object whenever live is being used. So just being mindful of that will help you get the most out of using laser cut and Accucut. However, Accucut is now a toggle that can be toggled off and on. So one of the things you might notice is that whenever I extrude, it actually limits it to the depth of the form, not able to go any further. If I were to pause it, I could actually drag the dot and extrude this as far as I want. However, for the initial extrude, it will just draw to the bounds of the object. In fact, we even have it specially catered towards where if you're dealing with multi-select, it will also reach towards only the bounds of your selection, allowing you to cut with a contoured fill. And the reason for this initially was so that if you were to, say, Alt-W, switch over to Hops tool, you could actually hover over dots that are in the vicinity of your object to actually bring your cutters back rather than having dots all the way out in space in irrelevant areas. But just letting users know that in the event that you do not like the Accucut behavior, you can of course turn it off. However, it is on by default, and it has been on for the last couple of versions, and we've just fought to, make it better and better so it can be a suitable default. But having Accucut on also gives the added bonus of being able to draw in front mode, as you see me doing here, and just dragging to penetrate the form. And this actually works in any view, not just front view. This has been of course, a long time request, so I'm happy to announce that it's finally a part of HardOps. This was something I was actually talking about earlier in the video, but I wanted to also do a section just talking about Accucut and how you can get the most out of it when it comes to Boxcutter. Whenever you're looking at an object frontally, if you were to draw a cut and begin moving the mouse, you're performing an extrusion, but you're using a system that's different than the extrusion you would get if you were to rotate your view and actually move your mouse out, because in this view we're actually extruding in accordance with our mouse cursor. But whenever you're looking at it in front view, we're attempting to use something that's a little bit more streamlined and optimized for view align frontal cutting. So it's important to keep that in mind. Sometimes you may be working and you'll be wondering why your movement may feel odd in both directions, and it's because there's a different system for whenever you first extrude locked onto the view. This can come in handy for things like, say, bringing up a circle and just cutting all the way through a mesh, or cutting only a particular amount through. You could also even press Shift T and taper it. I'll press Control D, go in and adjust the vert count and just place it. Control, jump off this point, bring it back a little bit, press Shift T, and even though I don't really have any conception of how much depth I have, I'm at least able to perform varying depths that are different between just me and the normal laser cut options that would be available. Whenever I refer to laser cut, I'm talking about just drawing a shape, giving it no depth, and just clicking, and it will just cut through the mesh. But just letting you know that there is a different type of extrusion method here that's in place than whenever you draw a shape and rotate your view and then begin performing the extrusion. So this might throw new users off, but should definitely come in handy whenever you're looking at things head on and are trying to perform an extrusion. However, what determines head on? If I look at this from this state and I begin moving the mouse, we see that this same extrusion method also takes over. But if I were to just rotate the view slightly, now I'm able to bring the shape back to its origin. I'm able to extrude it all the way through. I'm able to bring it all the way back. And this is something that you normally can't do on the initial extrusion that you're going to be given by Boxcutter. The reason it's like this is because initially we only had this constrained to view, but the subject of what about a surface came up, and so now you're looking at one of the interim steps of us finding our quote-unquote final solution. So what I'll do from here is just delete this object, and we'll just Shift A, add a cube, and I'll press Q, and let's just activate sphere cast. So now this object's been converted into a sphere. So now there comes a question: how can we cut a circle directly in front of the sphere? If we try to use snap dots, we would just look for our snap dot, grab this area, and cut through, and hope that it grabs the right normal and takes it all the way through in a straight direction, but we see that that wasn't the case. I could, of course, bring back Everscroll, Alt-R, to begin having to deal with manually positioning this, and then I could shift grab this, use reset axis, press Y and Z, and that is already a pretty big nightmare. Just letting you know that there's an easier way where you can just turn on grid, and having your mesh selected, of course, we can just start drawing off the mesh and then begin dragging to begin performing our extrusion. And without even having to rotate the view, I can give this a tapered cut going into the center. We'll do the same thing here where we begin bringing it back, pressing Shift T in order to taper. I have no idea how much depth is there, but I'm having fun finding out just visually as I'm working. So just letting you know that frontal cutting is one of the main goals that we sought to resolve with this release. It's a popular question how you can cut a hole directly in front of an irregular surface, and hopefully this answers that. When it comes to view alignment and grid, it's also been improved and streamlined. If I click and select my object and I begin tapping control, you can see that I'm attempting to orient the grid to the surface. If I have my mouse off of the surface, I'm now orienting with grid, which can bring a little bit of sanity back with such an irregular surface. And just in the same fashions that I've shown previously in this video, if I were to start off of the mesh and just bring the grid over the mesh, I can now begin using the frontal grid also on a surface of a regular nature. So if I try to, say, draw it this way, we see that that maybe isn't the most desired result. However, if I were to hold control, start off of the mesh, I can even bring this to the center of this, bring it out, get a certain amount of depth, press Shift T in order to taper it, press spacebar, and just like that I'm able to have this cut exactly where I want it. I could select the shape, start off the mesh, find another area, control double click, and it's going to repeat the cut. However, because of the whole Accucut thing, it didn't actually trim it to fit it exactly as I wanted, so we'll just need to use Everscroll, recall the cutter, bring it out, and here we are back in business. As we've discussed over the course of this video, repeat can be triggered by control double clicking. However, if you're in a clean file, new file, and you haven't performed a single cut and you control double click, you won't actually perform a repeat of anything because there's no data. You're just trying to repeat even though there's nothing on the repeat buffer. And while this is a self-explanatory support issue that is up to the fault of the user, it also shows a small hole that could be resolved. So for this reason, now whenever you're using Boxcutter, if you have nothing on the repeat buffer and you control double click, you will simply draw the logo. That's really all there is to it. In the event that you draw a shape, that shape will be on the repeat buffer. But just letting you know, in the event that you try to perform a repeat and you have nothing there, you will just repeat the Boxcutter logo. Here I am in Blender 2.83.12 using the last version of Boxcutter 717.17. If we hold control, we have our dot showing and we have a face dot precisely in the center. If we begin clicking and dragging off that dot, we see that we are basically drawing using corner draw, but orienting to that dot. This isn't the way that we want to work, so we would need to hold Alt in order to bring it out equilaterally and hold Shift in order to bring it out equidistant, where all the sides are exactly the same, giving us a perfect box. Then we can cut all the way through. This has always been the way that we use Boxcutter, so the same thing with edges. If we were to work an edge, I'm having to hold Alt in order to perform the extrusion all the way through, and this is really just no way to live. Since the beginning of dots, I've always complained about this and felt that there's just too many hand keys needed in order for us to perform this very basic maneuver. So I'm happy to announce that as the final cherry on this release, if you are using snap dots and you begin clicking and dragging from the center point, you will now use center draw just off the bat. Of course, you can press Alt in order to change it back to corner draw, which will just change the state altogether. Then you find yourself holding Alt and Shift once again, just like Legacy. However, just know that now you can just hold control, click and drag off of a dot, and you are done. And it's just that easy to perform a center draw on a shape. And the same thing goes with the other dots as well. So here I am grabbing one of these side dots, and I'm able to easily draw with just holding control, not having to reach over and hold Alt, which has driven me crazy for years. So I'm happy to announce that it's finally been resolved. So for the finale, let's create a orientation puzzle to play with and get intimate with all of our new systems. So we'll do an exercise I like to call working the corner. So I'm rotating my box and then I'm holding Alt so it just kind of snaps to a view. And then from here I'm just going to draw a box to begin cutting it out. And the first thing I'll do at this point is apply, because it's just much easier to grab all three of these and mark it, and then go in object mode and add a bevel. But I'll press L in order to change it to weight. And even though the shading's kind of breaking down, I know what I'm getting here by pressing Z. So we'll just click to apply, and then I'll shift click sharpen in order to roll down the auto smooth to get just the right amount. And then the next thing from here is to press D, switch over to box. You know, we can actually use just grid dots and we'll just bring out a box, but I'll press period in order to bring it out on center draw, and we'll press X in order to perform a slice. And so now we have our main box, which we can just put a bevel on and admire. However, we see the bevel doesn't actually catch all of the angles like this area. So just holding Alt and rolling the wheel should allow you to get where you're trying to go with that. And so the next thing is actually dealing with this piece. So first things first is I like to set up my alignment point. So for this, I'm going to just control click in order to align my view. And we roll the wheel while holding control in order to get the right angle. We can press E in order to just drop an empty. And from now on, whenever we're working, we can just go under mesh tools, control click align, and just control shift middle mouse button to roll between the various objects. And once you have an empty locked in, you can actually roll the wheel to change all the various types of perspectives that are available for that. So this isn't related to Boxcutter, but just useful to have when it comes to getting your view centered. The other thing is, now that we have this, we can actually jump back into that view again and just roll the wheel till we're looking at it exactly where we want. Maybe hold control shift in order to grab the empty, and we'll press Alt X in order to mirror, press V to mirror from view, and we'll just mirror this across to the other side, and this will just lessen our work and make our lives a lot simpler. So from here, press D, jump over to box, and if we press Shift V, we already know that we're in local, so that means that we're just going to draw to the local orientation of the object. That means if we try to draw kind of adjacent to this edge, it's not going to work out. But every time we draw local, we know exactly what we're going to get. So, you know, the secret to working a corner is to not take away too much of the mesh, because that can be problematic. Another thing is that you also want to be mindful of using weight modifiers when it comes to our cutters, because in order to bevel individual edges, we had to use weight. Just like you saw me bevel these individual corners, if I were doing that using V groups, it would not have worked out. So the easiest way to deal with this would be to right click cancel, and we'll just put another bevel on top. And I'll just hold Alt, roll the wheel backwards just till we catch it on all the angles. We can Alt click sharpen just to fix our shading. And this area is a little bit of a curiosity. Why does it look so bad? And with that, we can now continue. So basically now if I draw my cut, we see that we're not actually having our cut interfere with a weight modifier, because weight data is just going to impact it in that aspect, especially when it comes to sorting it above. So there's a myriad of ways we could have overridden this sort, but sometimes it's just easier to put another modifier on top and allow that one to be sorted instead of the one that you wish to not be sorted. So just performing our cuts, traditional box, nothing major here. Maybe pressing T to add some thickness to that one, but we're still just using just our local orientation because it pretty much is doing the job for this area. It's all we need, just local orientation. However, you know, when it comes to Box City, I always consider cutting all the way through and terminating the shape and taking areas out to be a loss. So it's always the long con for me. Like, the longer that I can work the surface down slowly, the more interesting of a result I feel I'll be able to achieve. If I wanted to just align to this empty, I could just press Shift 1, Shift 7 to align to an object that's selected. So our view align system merely plays on what Blender already has. As always, we want to really highlight what it is that makes Blender great already through our work. So now with that, I can just orient this plane real quick and just perform a diagonal line down the middle. So now let's talk about working this side. So that's where I would press Shift V and switch over to nearest edge. However, let's stay in local, because we also know that we can just grab a dot and hold Alt in order to pull away from that area. and perform an extrusion like so. However, we want to have an easier route, so let's just change this to nearest edge, and let's just get to work. So we don't have to worry about dots or orientation or anything like that, except for this situation here. This is where I would probably now want to solve it using grid, because with grid I can now highlight the nearest edge, scroll it down, and just get in here and create my shape. Of course, it's a box, so the grid isn't going to simplify my shape too much. Let's grab this edge precisely, and we could just bring this piece down. We want to use ever scroll to bring that piece back though, so that way we can shift 7 with our empty and just perform a view align cut, isolating this particular area like so. And we'll do the same thing here, except we want to grab an edge to align to in this area because nearest has betrayed us on an automatic level, which is why we need grid here to have our backs. So let's see what we're actually orienting to. This is looking pretty good. Usually after I get the orientation, I'll let go of control in order to kind of release myself from grid. Because grid lock is no longer a thing, that means now if you're holding control, you will snap, or not hold control, you will not snap, or vice versa. But there'll no longer be a situation, hopefully, where either control or not control are both performing snap, which is the situation I refer to as grid lock. It's been a thing for a while, and I'm happy to announce that for this particular update, we did do some things to try to mitigate it. So things should definitely be better. So I'm still reaching for that nearest edge. Sometimes it could be a battle, but it's definitely less of a battle than drawing the shape via trial and error. I'm not the biggest fan of pressing undo over and over. So you'll see me taking steps to always avoid undo redo in Blender, and that also comes down to sometimes using the F9 window. These things have just a habit in the past of ending my Blender sessions. So right here I used nearest edge and it just didn't work out, but you know what would work out would be nearest, but I don't want to press Shift V. Instead I want to pick this edge and bring this in, press B to bevel, press T to solidify, and we'll bring it out ever so slightly, and let's begin working the top. So we'll just bring this area down, but instead of a straight extrusion we'll press W and make it a wedge, just because we haven't put enough wedges in our surfaces yet. Wedges are one of my favorite forms of detailing whenever it comes to using Boxcutter. Also, now that bevel is being read on all levels for snap, which is one of the reasons it's now faster, you definitely want to be mindful of angling yourself on top of a bevel. So I will grab this edge, hold control, roll the grid down a little bit, and a little bit of inaccuracy there, I saw that. We'll be talking about that after the video. However, I did also point out that there can be some irregularities whenever it comes to smaller grids compared to normal, so that'll be more than likely a study somewhere down the line, unless it's a technical issue with floating point numericals or something, and then we'll have to see. But you know, throughout all of these videos, even when I'm showcasing these products, I can always spot like a million issues and things that I want to improve even as I'm working. So sometimes I'll just kind of pause because I'm like making a mental note in my head of things to discuss with the team and point out. It's like, yeah, it was a good release. However, our work continues. We must immediately deal with this, this, and this. I know I'm terrible, but while I'm just BSing with you guys and just performing some cuts here, you can almost find a zen whenever you're just playing around with grid and box cutting and locating your orientation point. And this is the experience that I'm so excited to be sharing with you guys after we get this video completed, once this release is in your hands. Is, you know, orientation was definitely one of those things that I knew was one of our weak suits inside of Boxcutter. So anyone truly analytical was probably able to notice that that was something that we were needing to double back for. So with this shape, interesting and all, but let's try to take it to the next level. You know what I like to do with stuff like this is shift click Smart Apply to perform a duplicate. And with this piece, we can now perform an inset. This is a type of workflow I envision someday coming to selection of Boolean and HardOps. But for now, it is something kind of delegated to Smart Apply as a kind of experimental thing. But I'm always thinking about how we can get this integrated into other more interactive aspects of our tools, so that way it's a more intuitive experience. But even the process of getting in here and cleaning up doubles whenever you perform such a strong inset, I feel is probably essential. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with secret doubles and booleans that are just not working. So now that we have this set up, we can perform a solidify, and then a bevel, or at least lowering the bevel. So we'll select this piece and the other piece, perform a difference, and now we have taken this piece to an angular city. And this is just, you know, this isn't one of those tests that you're supposed to hang on. It's just you know, if you're looking for a fun time, you know, give this a try to get acquainted with our orientation system. But by all means, definitely be testing this on more serious projects, because that's where we're aiming all of our efforts now. Or not even now, we always have. We've always thought about, you know, what about the end game of these tools? You know, it's good to make something that people can understand, but what about the version for people that already understand it? So this piece right here is just terrible. So you know what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to align my view to the empty, and then we can go in and actually look at this from the side. And all we really need is to get this point over. So I'm going to change my orientation method to view, which means I can now press GX and snap it here, and we'll just dissolve that single point, and the other side actually looks fine. There's always going to be a little bit of geometry management needing to be done whenever you're trying to duplicate and cut these things in, because if you have doubles, I seriously am warning you that it will come back to haunt you. In fact, you know, with every boolean that you set up, the more complex it is, the more of a chance that you should spend a moment kind of inspecting the result to make sure that things go right all the way around, because so often a choice made with one bool will come back to haunt you with another one, especially if it's a shortcoming. Just one of those troubleshooting things I'm always pondering. So we'll do the same thing with this area. Just shift apply duplicate, press I, and control I, and we'll just give this some solidification and perform our difference. And we could do one more. I mean, we could do a lot more than just one more, but let's just have some fun here. So we'll press control I. We'll select both of these, and now we can look at this and say that we have worked the corner pretty nicely. However, circles are always a thing too when it comes to a work the corner example. So I have my circle, but it came out at 8 verts because I was making an example earlier. So I'll press Control D, and we'll change it to 32, and just perform an extrusion. And let's just shift it to live and select the top face and just Control click mark in order to perform a reverse bevel. And we see that our origin didn't actually go where it was supposed to on the cutter. And this is because of our origin option. So we want our origin to be on top of the center face. This one will set it to the bounding box center of the object. This one will set it to the center of the face that you initially draw. So let's try that same maneuver one more time. Even though I know we're redoing it from scratch, I just know it's going to be a heck of a lot easier this time because our origin options were set up from the get-go. So let's put one more here. And we see that things are getting a little bit slower, and that's because, you know, the Going's definitely getting tough with the amount of booleans and bevel work that we've created for ourselves. But let's take a look at our helper for booleans, and we see that we don't have any exact booleans set up on this at this time, so it shouldn't be too bad. But to speed things up, I am going to turn on pause mode. And for some reason, even pause took a little bit of a hang there. You know, that, like I always say, there's always more work to be done in that pursuit of perfection. Perform the extrusion. While that extrusion is taking a moment, I will ponder why circle in pause mode is slow. That will need to be checked into if you're listening. So now we'll make another cut, and we'll press G and move it around, and we see that this cut did penetrate. For a moment, from the angle I was looking at, it didn't look like it penetrated, but we're good to go. So let's reverse bevel that as well. And just something about reverse bevel, just can't get enough of using it, especially on the hop side. I'm always pondering it. So now that we have our corner work, the first thing I'm going to do is save this as a cube box. Whenever I release the missing boxes, that's why the numbers are so low now on my cube boxes, because I deleted all the ugly boxes. So now I got to make nicer boxes to replace them. So I'm going to select this particular area, and we're just going to shift click curve extract in order to extract this area out. Of course, since this edge isn't going all the way in like it was, because we just extracted it and solidified it, it's no longer rounding it here or here. That means that we can actually remove the first bevel modifier. We could probably remove the first Boolean modifier too. We don't really need any of this. We can keep this top level bevel, but it doesn't appear to be doing much either. Okay, actually it is. It's affecting this area. So you know what, we'll keep that. But what I will do is go in edit mode and just select these 3 points and press Ctrl-Shift-B and roll the wheel until we get a fine result. And just to really top it off, we'll Control-click bevel to just add another bevel. And this piece is pretty much good to go. However, in the back, we will need to manually round this in order to make it look good. However, we could also try it non-destructively. So if I Control-click mark, it's going to look terrible. But if I hold Shift and I roll it up the stack, then I can actually get it higher up in the stack and get a very nice result, which is what we're seeing here. We want to add more segments to our bevel because, you know, faceting is just not good for anyone. And we are done. So this is our cube so far. When it comes to adding a ground plane, I like to select everything, press QOT, press spacebar, switch to plane with spacebar, and then just Control roll until I get the shape underneath. Press S50, Alt M, blank material, Control I, Alt M, Control clicking blank material to give every single one of these objects a unique material. And now we're ready to proceed. So we'll turn off snapping because we still have this dot. And because we have this dot, that means we can, this is like the most strangely oriented box, right? This is because we're still under nearest edge. So hopefully if I got any point across in this video is that if your orientation is going wrong, definitely use Shift V and look at your orientation sub panel. If you don't get Boxcutter, just stick in local. But once you start diving into Boxcutter, you definitely want to, I don't know which piece I am cutting. Probably neither. Let's press escape. Let's select the right piece. Bevel, 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 bevel. Just so many bevels going on with this shape. We Control tilde, we see that for some reason it's not letting our cuts reflect on this particular model anymore. So I'm definitely going to be wondering what's going on there, except I'm not going to wonder long because I got to know the answer. First we smart apply. Oh, you know why it's not showing? Pause mode. I'm terrible. Sorry. I'll undo, leave pause mode off, and let's just bring out our box. And all I want to do was just perform a little slice to just give this area a runner up. And let's also give that a blank material. And now that I'm looking at it from this frontal view, my favorite thing to do afterwards is to just drop in a camera. We'll just scale up that camera empty so we're looking at it all the way. Jump over to Look Dev, press Alt VV, and there we are looking at our final result. Since we are using HardOps, we can press Alt VB and just roll the wheel until we get something that truly shows things the way that we want it to be shown. Like so. Something loud, but not too proud, but definitely loud. So now that we have this, we could set our frame range to like 2,000 frames. That's about long enough to be a good ad. And if we let the timeline play, this is what we have so far. So usually what I like to do is I'll let the timeline play until it starts showing angles that I consider unflattering. And then I will, even though I have no overlay showing, I'm going to shift right click to place my 3D cursor there. You can't see it, but you just got to trust me, my cursor's there. If we press Q again with nothing selected, press Alt A to deselect. If I press Q with nothing selected, I can just add another camera, and this will be our result so far. And we'll let that play for a couple of 100 frames until about there. And now we'll place this in the center and pull out a little bit, and with nothing selected, shift click camera. This time we're going to add a bounce camera. Actually, bounce camera turned out to be a mistake. We actually want all of our cameras to go the right direction. So this time I'm just going to regular click, which adds another camera. And we're just setting up our shots for this turntable. So now that we're about here, let's look at this again. And we'll look at it right here. Place our cursor right there with shift right click, press Q with nothing selected. And this time we will shift click add camera in order to add a bounce camera. So now this particular camera will go one way and then bounce back and go the other way. However, with the length of our timeline, we might not be able to see it. However, looks like we caught it just at the end of a bounce. So once we get to about this area, we can, let's bring up view align, and holding Control Shift, let's try that again. Wow, I can't even see my empty and all of that. So I'm just going to realign my view. Probably need to select the face in edit mode. And then from there, I can align the view just like I want. And from here, let's set up another camera. So I have this area selected. You can see my cursor there. And we will just add a camera. And from here, there will just be this camera turning in this particular area to finish out this frame, to finish out this animation. So just a very quick animation using Hops cameras, but you can see all the cameras focusing on this area like it's a star. It's like, interview, you got a statement, from this area of the cube that we've been working. It's kind of funny, but you got to make yourself laugh when you're doing 3D. Anyways, Control Spacebar, we'll just let this animation play. And just like that, within 23 minutes, we have ran through the exercise of what I call working the corner. So for this shot, just gonna have to extend this video. Sorry guys. This area, I don't know why it looks like that, but it's not gonna work. So what we want to do is actually improve the roundness here, because if I'm looking at this render and I have this very big area coming in looking so bad, it's just going to be an eyesore. So let's raise this to 24, which kind of breaks this area a little bit, but that's fine. We can do the same thing with this, change it to 24. Let's also select this surface, locate the first bevel, which is playing off of weight, and raise it up to 24. So we probably should have done that before we started doing extraction, but if I wanted to, I could harden the shape in 2D and then use subdivision to ease this arc, but we are approaching the 25-minute mark, for which I apologize. So with that, we'll just let this animation play out, and I hope everyone enjoyed this latest update. A lot has gone into it, and I'm so excited to finally be getting it out the door. There's so many parties involved with it. I must, of course, give a shout out to AR, Loof, and Proxy for their endless efforts with keeping Boxcutter not only afloat, but running well and continuing to move forward and get better. I have such high hopes for this tool, and alignment was just one of those things that we just had to get in and do something about. So with that, I will wrap up this video, and I'll see you guys next time. Usually I have on viewport denoising whenever I let an animation play. However, lately it's been looking a little bit fuzzier than usual, which is just not going to cut it. However, luckily Blender has settings to be able to improve this. So if we turn off viewport denoising, We can now let the animation play out where it's just a little bit noisier. However, it's also a little bit sharper and a little bit more clear with showing all the details that we've worked into this corner area of the cube. Of course, these issues with shadows won't be there whenever you render, but it will be there whenever you're playing it back in the viewport. But really, I just overlooked those things. However, viewport shadows always have driven me crazy. But with that, I can now truly wrap up this video, and I'll see you guys next time.